What happens when a terrified teenager walks onto the biggest talent show in the world, stands beside his best friend, while a television juggernaut openly doubts him, and then, in a span of 90 seconds, makes Simon Cowell eat every single one of his words? That is the story millions of people think they know about Jonathan Antoine, but the performance you saw on Britain's Got Talent in 2012 was never really about the stage. It was the visible tip of an iceberg that had been building beneath the surface for 17 years, long before those floodlights hit his face. Jonathan Antoine was 4 years old when the bullying began. 4. That is not an exaggeration or a retrospective dramatization. By his own account, his weight became a target before he had even learned to fully articulate what was happening to him. Schoolyard cruelty escalated from name-calling to physical humiliation. In one particularly scarring incident during year 4, another student sat on him specifically to determine how much he weighed. That moment stayed with him for decades. By the time he reached secondary school, the torment had become so relentless that Jonathan began to feel like a ghost moving through his own life. But here's what most people do not understand about that period. The bullying did not just make Jonathan sad, it nearly killed him. Before the television cameras, before the standing ovations, before the million-pound record deals, Jonathan Antoine was a teenager who had already planned his own death. He thought about suicide every single day. He had dropped out of school with no direction, no prospects, and a growing conviction that the world would simply be better off without him. When you watch his audition video today, you are not watching a nervous kid. You are watching a survivor who had absolutely no idea that his life was about to be saved by a reality TV show. That salvation arrived in the form of a 16-year-old girl named Charlotte Giaconelli. The two had met at West Hatch High School in Chigwell, where a singing teacher named Jenny Ewington recognized something extraordinary in Jonathan's voice. But the raw talent alone would never have made it to a stage. Jonathan's anxiety was so profound that he could barely function in social settings, let alone perform for millions. Charlotte became his anchor. She was the one who pushed him to audition for Britain's Got Talent. She was the one who stood beside him when every instinct told him to run. Years later, Jonathan would say something that reframes the entire BGT narrative. "Before the show, I thought about suicide every day. Everyone said I was so loyal to my friend for sticking by her, but the truth was that I was in such a bad place, there was no way I could have gone near a stage without her." That is the real story of Jonathan and Charlotte. It was never about romance, despite what fans speculated. It was never a calculated partnership for success. It was a lifeline disguised as a duet. March 24, 2012. Jonathan and Charlotte walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage as unknowns. The judges saw exactly what they expected to see: an awkward, overweight 17-year-old in a baggy t-shirt standing next to a poised young woman. Simon Cowell, never one to hide his first impressions, made a dismissive comment that suggested the duo was not worth taking seriously. The audience shifted uncomfortably. It looked like another forgettable audition from people who had no business being there. Then Jonathan opened his mouth. The first notes of the prayer hit the auditorium like a physical force. Whatever you have heard about that performance, the reality was even more improbable. This was not just a good voice. This was a tenor that seemed to belong to someone 3 decades older, someone who had lived through heartbreak and loss, and somehow transformed it into beauty. The sound that came out of that shy, bullied teenager silenced the room. Amanda Holden's eyes went wide. The audience erupted before the first verse even finished, and Simon Cowell, the same man who had written him off seconds earlier, was suddenly comparing Jonathan to Luciano Pavarotti. The video went viral almost instantly. Within days, it had accumulated millions of views. News outlets around the world ran stories comparing Jonathan to Susan Boyle, another unlikely phenomenon who had emerged from the same show. But there was a crucial difference. Susan Boyle had been a solo act. Jonathan was half of a duo, and Cowell immediately spotted what he considered a problem. On national television, he suggested that Charlotte was holding Jonathan back. He openly questioned whether she had the vocal capacity to match her partner's extraordinary gift. The moment was uncomfortable, invasive, and completely unnecessary, but it also revealed something about Jonathan that the audience had not yet seen. He refused. Jonathan looked at the most powerful man in the music industry and declined his advice. "We've come on here as a duo, and we're going to stay here as a duo," he said. The audience wept. The judges applauded. And what almost nobody understood at the time was that Jonathan was not being noble or romantic. He was telling the literal truth. He could not have been on that stage without Charlotte. Her presence was not a hindrance. It was the only reason he was standing there at all. The duo advanced through the semi-finals and into the grand finale. They performed The Prayer again, received another standing ovation, and seemed destined for victory. But Britain's Got Talent had other plans. When the results were announced, Jonathan and Charlotte did not win the competition. They came in second place. The act that beat them was a dancing dog named Pudsey. A canine in a carefully choreographed routine had outperformed one of the most extraordinary vocal talents the show had ever produced. Jonathan later described the moment with characteristic understatement. He felt his organs sinking, he said, but he refused to cry on camera. And then something unexpected happened. Coming second turned out to be better than winning. The day after the finale, Simon Cowell was already on the phone. By May 13, 2012, it was official. Jonathan and Charlotte had signed a £1 million recording contract with Seco Cowell's label. The duo, who had not won the competition, had just won the jackpot. Their debut album, Together, dropped on September 24, 2012, and shot to number 5 on the UK charts. They sold more than 250,000 albums. Documentary crews followed them through France and Italy. ITV produced a special about their journey. Simon Cowell even apologized on camera for suggesting they split up. It looked like a fairy tale. It was not. Behind the scenes, the partnership was cracking under pressure that no one could have anticipated. Jonathan wanted to focus on classical opera, the music that had saved him during his darkest years. Charlotte was drawn to musical theater and West End ballads. Neither of them was wrong. They had simply been thrown together by circumstance and a singing teacher who saw potential in their contrasting voices. What worked beautifully for a 3-minute television audition was not sustainable as a career. Their second album, Perhaps Love, released in October 2013, hinted at the growing distance. It included solo tracks from both singers, a clear signal that each was preparing to stand alone, but the official announcement still came as a shock. On February 2, 2014, Jonathan and Charlotte confirmed that they were splitting up. Both had been offered separate solo deals by Sony Classical, and both had accepted. The statement they released tried to sound optimistic. The media coverage was not so kind. Headlines suggested Charlotte had dumped Jonathan. Fans were devastated. The duo that had captured the world's heart was finished. What the headlines missed was the truth Jonathan later revealed. He had not been abandoned. He had been released. Charlotte raised up my confidence to the level I could go on BGT, he explained. Neither of us had been ensemble artists. We loved solo performances. It was the natural evolution of the thing. In other words, Simon Cowell had been right about the music. He had simply been wrong about the motive. Jonathan did not need to dump Charlotte. He needed to be strong enough to eventually leave on his own terms. The split ended more than their professional partnership. Jonathan and Charlotte barely spoke in the years that followed. They lost contact entirely. Two people who had been each other's lifelines became strangers, not out of animosity, but simply because the industry devours friendships and spits out the remains. October 13, 2014. Jonathan's debut solo album, Tenore, hit the shelves. The pressure was almost unbearable. Could he succeed without Charlotte? Would the public accept him as a solo artist, or had they only loved the duo? The answer came quickly. Tenore shot straight to number 1 on the Classical Artist Album chart, making Jonathan the youngest tenor ever to achieve that feat. Placido Domingo personally invited him to perform as a guest at the iTunes Festival. He toured America. He played the Muhammad Ali Celebrity Fight Night. He was proving, night after night, that his voice was not dependent on anyone else. But success does not erase trauma, and Jonathan was carrying more trauma than almost anyone knew. At 18, he had entered a relationship with a girlfriend who struggled with severe mental health issues. She engaged in self-harm using blades from pencil sharpeners, and she did not hide it from him. For someone already battling his own demons, the relationship was devastating. It left emotional scars that would take years to understand. Around the same time, Jonathan was diagnosed with clinical depression. The condition was so severe that he was forced to cancel a major performance at the Royal Albert Hall, one of the most prestigious venues in the world. The years of bullying, the weight struggles that had begun at age 4, the suicidal ideation, the toxic relationship, the pressure of sudden fame, it all converged at once. In 2014, at age 21, Jonathan experienced what he now describes as a breakdown. At the time, he did not have the vocabulary to explain what was happening to him. He only knew that he could not keep up with the relentless demands of his new life. He felt like he was drowning in plain sight. And yet somehow, he kept singing. His second solo album, Believe, came out in 2016. A concept album called Going the Distance, recorded with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, followed in 2020. He performed Nessun Dorma, one of the most challenging arias in the classical repertoire, and he nailed it. The boy who had been dismissed by Simon Cowell was now filling concert halls on 2 continents. But the gap between public triumph and private struggle had never been wider. April 2, 2022, Autism Awareness Day. Jonathan Antoine received a diagnosis that would fundamentally recontextualize every moment of his life. He was on the autism spectrum. At 27 years old, he finally had a framework for understanding why he had always felt so fundamentally different from everyone around him. He did not share the news publicly until 2 years later. When he finally posted about it on Instagram, his words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades searching for answers. The recontextualization of a life already lived is a scary thing to reckon with, he wrote. Those things done are already set. There is no going back from here. The diagnosis explained everything. The social struggles that had made school a nightmare, the way he processed emotions differently from his peers, the intense, almost obsessive focus on music, the difficulty maintaining relationships, the sensory overload that had often been misdiagnosed as anxiety or depression. None of it was a character flaw. None of it meant he was broken. His brain simply worked differently than the neurotypical standard. Jonathan's autism diagnosis also helped him understand his breakdown in 2014. What he had experienced was not just depression. It was an autistic meltdown, a neurological response to overwhelming circumstances that he had no tools to navigate. His mother had suspected something for years. Mothers, he noted, always know. The public response to his announcement was overwhelmingly positive. Jonathan had become an unexpected advocate for neurodiversity, using his platform to encourage others to seek answers about their own minds. The filter of our perception generates necessary atypicalities, divergences from base reality, he wrote. We all get our own little matrix hidden just behind our eyes, and we each see a different tint over the real world. It was a profound statement from someone who had spent most of his life feeling like he was looking through the wrong lens. Between 2020 and 2024, Jonathan underwent a physical transformation that shocked even his most devoted fans. He lost more than 70 pounds. Some sources suggest as much as 120 pounds. The change was not about vanity. It was about survival. Jonathan had struggled with his weight since childhood, using food as comfort during his darkest periods. By the time he reached his mid-20s, the consequences were catching up with him. His thyroid condition made weight management even more difficult. He had spent years in a cycle of self-medicating with food, then hating himself for it, then eating more to cope with the shame. The turning point came when Jonathan finally made an active choice to change. He started walking 10,000 steps every single day, even if that meant pacing back and forth in his bedroom when the weather was bad. He cut out the fast food that had been a staple of his American tours. He stopped letting life live him and started grabbing the world with his hands. The results were dramatic, but the process was slow. This was not a crash diet or a quick fix. It was the steady, disciplined work of someone who had finally decided that he wanted to be present for his own future. By 2024, Jonathan felt stronger and healthier than he had in 10 years. Photos showed a dramatically different person from the shy teenager who had walked onto the BGT stage. His signature curly hair remained, but his face had slimmed, his body had changed, and his eyes held a confidence that had been entirely absent when he was 17. The transformation was not about meeting anyone else's standards. It was about his health, his longevity, and his ability to keep doing the thing he loved most, singing. As of 2026, Jonathan Antoine is entering what he calls a powerful new era. His upcoming album, Speaking to You, is scheduled for release on March 27, 2026. The singles released ahead of the album, Jeff Buckley's Lilac Wine and Radiohead's No Surprises, reveal an artist who has stopped trying to fit into anyone's expectations. These are not opera standards or classical crossover pieces. They are deeply personal interpretations of songs he has loved since his GCSE music class, when he first studied Buckley's work and discovered a broader sonic palette. The album represents something more important than commercial success. It represents peace. Jonathan describes himself now as an artist at peace with himself, with an open heart, and unguarded, trusting the music to do what it has always done best, meet listeners exactly where they are. That is a radically different statement from anything he could have said a decade ago when he was fighting for survival on a reality TV stage. His relationship with Charlotte remains distant. They rarely speak, a fact that Jonathan acknowledges with sadness, but not bitterness. "When you're grafting, you don't really get the time to speak to your friends," he once explained. The romantic relationship that inspired his album Believe has also ended, though Jonathan has kept the details private. What matters now is not who has left his life, but who has stayed his family, his devoted fans who call themselves Antoines, and the voice that has carried him through everything. Jonathan continues to advocate for mental health awareness and neurodiversity acceptance. He has spoken openly about his suicide attempts, his depression, and his autism diagnosis, using his platform to destigmatize conversations that many people still cannot have. His estimated net worth sits at approximately $4 million, earned through album sales, concerts, and television appearances. But the number that matters more is the one he rarely discusses: the two fans who have reportedly woken from comas while listening to his music, earning him the unofficial title of the Coma Whisperer. Jonathan Antoine's story is not a typical talent show narrative. It is not about the thrill of victory or the agony of defeat. It is not about cutting in second to a dancing dog or signing a £1 million contract, or any of the surface-level details that make for clickable headlines. It is a story about survival, about a 4-year-old boy who was taught that his body made him unworthy of kindness, about a teenager who planned his own death because he could not imagine a future where he belonged, about a young man who broke down on stage and in private, who lost friendships and relationships and nearly lost himself entirely, who received a diagnosis at 27 that finally explained why he had always felt like an alien in his own skin. And yet, here he is, still singing, still showing up, still refusing to be defined by the cruelty of others or the chaos of his own mind. Jonathan Antoine did not win Britain's Got Talent, but he won something far more important. He won the right to keep living on his own terms. The next time you watch that audition video, the one with the baggy t-shirt, and the dismissive judge, and the audience that could not believe what it was hearing, remember what you are actually seeing. You are not watching a nervous teenager who got lucky. You are watching a survivor who had already survived the worst years of his life before he ever stepped onto that stage. The performance was the easy part. Everything that came before it was the real battle. Jonathan Antoine is still fighting that battle, but now, for the first time, he is winning. This script draws from verified interviews and publications including the Mirror 2014, 2026, Yahoo Life UK 2024, OK Magazine 2024, The Los Angeles Times 2012, The London Evening Standard 2014, and Jonathan Antoine's official website and Instagram statements 2024 to 2026. All quotes and factual claims are traceable to these sources. No material is fabricated or sourced from unverified third-party aggregators.